So I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Honors College Associate Professor Amaris Ketcham. Amaris's creative work has appeared in creative nonfiction, the Kenyon Review, Rattle, The e-Reader. Her book of poems, The Poetic Inventory of the Sandia Mountains, was published in 2018. Her work on poetic routes has been adopted by the Albuquerque City Planning Department as a way to use poetry as a means to understand neighborhoods and community characters and values. As a practitioner of creative placemaking, she has taught poetry workshops in Albuquerque's Bosque and places text institutes within the National Collegiate Honors Council. Today, Amaris will be sharing excerpts from her newest book, Glitches in the FBI, which uses the technique of found poetry, effectively limiting her word bank to the transcripts of the episodes of the X-Files, in which she crafts entirely new and vivid poetry. Author Kevin Zepper states of her work, "This is an ingenious collection of poems, utilizing repurposed script dialogues from the iconic and surreal television program, The X-Files. The selected script fragments, carefully reassembled in free verse form, creates a third stream, a new form based on the originality of ideas and organization." Please join me in welcoming Amaris Ketcham.
Hi, everybody. Oh, I like the quiet claps. I was like, and now I'm imagining that I'm walking up to a podium and not just like shifting in my chair here. It looks like we still have some people trickling in, but I'm going to go ahead and jump in to my talk. I'm going to share my screen and pull up a PowerPoint just so you can kind of see some examples of some of the things I want to highlight. I'm going to start by giving just a little overview of the project and then talk about found poetry, dive deeper into the project itself, and finally I'll share some poems with you. So let's see. All right, so as Megan said, Glitches in the FBI was published this year by Casa Urraca Press in Abiquiu, New Mexico. From the mythology of freedom bound to bureaucracy to the reasons we need stories about sea serpents, Glitches in the FBI makes room for the audience to reflect on their life, their curiosities, and their societies. This collection of found poetry uses dialogue from the X-Files as inspiration, retaining the mood and mystery and spooky speculations, without any direct references to the television show. There are aliens, of course, but they're mixed with a variety of folk beliefs. UFOs, men in black, and abductions all make appearances, as do foxes, hummingbirds, elk hounds, childhood memories, grief, and longing for a better future. Unlike fan fiction, which appropriates the characters and storylines of the plots that it creates new work from, these poems describe neither what happens in the X-Files nor who the characters are. Mirroring and adapting big ideas and issues, these poems also include a smattering of references and slang that make them read, I think, kind of like a 1990s Homeric. Some of the poems may remind you that we're so entrenched in miracles they've become ordinary, while others will let you know to follow your hunches as you explore the mystery of our everyday existence. So Glitches in the FBI was just released at the beginning of October. The project came about as during the pandemic, I was watching X-Files again and found myself listening to the dialogue and being impressed at the words that came up. There's a great mix of concrete images, trailer parks in space, McGruff the crime dog, and more abstract language pertaining to science, investigation, and government conspiracies. I admired the writing and wanted to play with the idea of remixing different ideas and images from the show. And had the original idea in the fall of 2012, and I wrote a couple poems back then, some of which were published, but then I set it aside until our pandemic lockdown began. Before the pandemic, I'd spent most of my evenings with communities that I no longer had access to. And so I started rewatching the X-Files as a way to kind of fill some time and perhaps return to a more comfortable space in the 1990s. I recognized words and dialogue and remembered those old poems from 2012. So I pitched a chapbook idea to Casa Urraca. Usually poetry books don't get picked up on a pitch, just so you know, but the editor and publisher really liked the idea, and so he gave me 2 months to finish the book. And here we are. So I spent the summer watching the X-Files, reading transcripts, and writing poems. So a lot of these are pretty experimental, and that's part of it being a found poetry project. So before I share the poems with you, I want to discuss what literary collage is, and pop poetry and some of the choices grounding the work. So found poetry. So it seems like a lot of students know found poetry as blackout poetry. So if that helps you contextualize it a little bit from wherever you first learned about it, is a type of literary collage where words and phrases are taken from an original source and placed into a new context to be read as poetry. This reframing of the original material has a long history, often employed by the Dadaists and surrealists to challenge our concepts of authorship, spark creativity, or revised drafts of work in progress. Some of the earliest stirrings of cut-up began in the Dada arts movement in Europe, breaking from the traditional expression through the use of irrational, illogical, and nonsensical transitions. One poet is believed to be the originator of what we would describe as cut-up poetry at this time, Tristan Zarza. As the legend has it, he took words from a newspaper, cut them up, put them in a hat. After announcing he would create a spontaneous poem, he pulled the individual words from the hat. The audience rioted, as they so often do at avant-garde art gatherings. Later, he would write his instructions for creating the cut-up, how to make a Dadaist poem. The next sort of big contributor to this cut-up movement in the literary context would be William Burroughs, who is quoted as saying, writing is 50 years behind art, in thinking about the use of collage and where the art movement had sort of taken that in the 40s and 50s. Burroughs said that words aren't owned by anyone, and so the cut-up is something that he would do to stimulate creativity. He also has a famous book, Naked Lunch, that he wrote the entire thing, cut it up, and sort of rearranged and reassembled with the idea of, oh, you can still read it. I don't know if anyone's ever tried to read Naked Lunch. It's very difficult, but that's kind of like a really popular, people like to try to read it in college sort of text. Some more popular contemporary artists who you might recognize, although I guess quite a few of them passed away, are musicians who use the cut-up style. David Bowie, Kurt Cobain, Tom York from Radiohead. So David Bowie, for one, referred to found poetry as quote unquote Western tarot. I've read that writing found poetry is a form of self-annihilation of the author because it brings up so many questions about who creates work, the person who first wrote the words or the person who rearranges them. For example, David Shields' book, Reality Hunger, is an entirely remixed and composed of other people's original writings. The book is curated as much as written, collaged, and well-researched. It's an argument of text, it's making an argument, and he's very successful in making it. So you can read it as a straightforward critique without even realizing that all of the words come from different sources, their original sources and context pointed out at the notes at the end of the text. Some authors and artists prefer to highlight the source material in addition to the act of finding poetry in their starting material, whether it's a government document or a daily newspaper. Sometimes these authors will think about how they want the page itself to perform. There are several ways to physically alter original text, depending on whether you want the original text to stay and say present a layered reading or draw more attention to the act of redaction itself. Night Moves came out in 2013 by Stephanie Barber. So this is a collection of comments from the YouTube videos, no, just from one YouTube video of Bob Seger's Night Moves. Stephanie Barber collected these comments and arranged them into a New York work, that unites discovery, nostalgia, and arguments between commenters. Many of the comments converse with one another, often directly. The poem moves forward as the commenters play off one another. Seeking Nancy Johnson might come up and then continue for a few pages. And backward as the countdown of likes displays a rallying point. How does this song get 75 dislikes? This could obviously get quickly out of hand, but Barber reorients the focus. Isn't Seeger's song a tale of youthful lust remembered? And didn't half the commenters connect with the song as youths in the dorms, in the trusty woods? And here they are again, now looking to remember. Their autumns are closing in, and they are now the speaker, not the memory of the speaker, but they made their memories to the speaker's memory. It's tricky, huh? In this way, the book reveals a meta-nostalgia of Middle America. The found text here is kept in full, although I assume heavily edited and rearranged, or at least rearranged. Barber, however, is not specific in that point in any kind of introductory materials. Another example is nets. In this work, Jen Bervin writes that she, quote, stripped Shakespeare's sonnets to the bare nets to make space for the poems to open, porous and possible, a divergent elsewhere. When we write poems, the history of poetry is with us, pre-inscribed with the white page. When we read or write poems, we do it with or against this palimpsest. She retains the full sonnet in each case, presenting it at 50% black. So the sonnet is light gray. The words she keeps are in full black, creating a contrast needed to read it separately. So for instance, this is sonnet 18, which famously starts, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" And we get the new poem, "Thou wanderest in shade in lines to time." Another example, which I used to have in my office, I know it's somewhere, but it's a very tiny book, and so I couldn't find it to scan it for you, is A Little White Shadow, which is a slim volume of the same name from 1889. And the author, Mary Ruffel, has taken a bottle of whiteout to create a smaller, more concise narrative that almost reads like haiku. It's filled with surprising shifts in meaning. So that one is most similar to what a lot of people call blackout poetry or redaction poetry, because the tactile nature of the whiteout on the page or a Sharpie on the page. Hey, look at that. It's exciting. Thank you. So one of our guests is showing it in the tiny Zoom screen there. Our next example is Humament. In this example, Tom Phillips takes a redactive approach, making each page a work of art. A Humament has been a work in progress since 1966, when artist Tom Phillips set himself a task to find a secondhand book for 3 pence and to alter every page, painting by painting, collage and cut-up techniques to create an entirely new version. The book he found was an 1892 Victorian Obscurity, A Human Document by W.H. Mallock, in which Phillips transformed a human document into a humament. So even the word, the title, is a kind of collapse or redaction. The first version was printed in Tetrad Press by Tetrad Press in 1973, and he's continued to transform it, revise it, and develop it ever since. There's been several printings of this book that you can find in various bookstores. Let's see. Sometimes the source material that you've chosen to do found poetry with seems to dictate its own form of how the words will be lifted and rearranged. So back to this specific project. So during the pandemic, I started watching this show again, and certain episodes would stand out to me. Maybe I heard an interesting word or a phrase, and I wanted to experiment with it. I would look up the transcript and from there pull out words that I found interesting. So I had a running Word document, and I would put a set of verbs, and then a set of nouns, a set of adjectives, maybe some little phrases, only 2 or 3 words long, hoping that it wouldn't be considered plagiarism. You know, we all know the plagiarism rules, right? We've all written essays before. And that's also, you know, why so many of those other books that I've talked about are from the 1880s, so that the copyright is expired. So you definitely know that you're out of plagiarism territory. And then I would usually sit and stare at this Word document and this little word bank and think, this is impossible. There's no way I can write a poem out of these. But sometimes I would see an entrance. So maybe there were a couple words about handwriting or IVF, and that's what the poem was going to be about. So the episode then would provide an occasion for the poem, and then I would try to write away from the episode itself. This is a practice that Richard Hugo talks about in his book, Triggering Town. Richard Hugo is a Montana poet, was a Montana poet, who would drive to different towns around Montana, which is got a lot of mining towns. There's a big boom bust economy. And he would go fishing and then stop in some town, usually at a bar, and write a poem about that town. But the poems would always, even though they were inspired by the town, they wouldn't just be about the town itself. And so that was part of his philosophy on writing poetry, that you have an occasion or a trigger for the poem, but then the poem somehow moves away from that to develop deeper meaning. So I wanted to take the poems in a new direction so that they wouldn't directly mention the main characters or plots of the television show, hoping then that people wouldn't have to be familiar with the X-Files themselves and to enjoy the show. However, at the top of each poem, just under the title, I have referenced which episode I used the words from, just so if people are familiar with the show, they can maybe go back to it, revisit it, and have another way to enjoy the poems in the television show. I did play a game with my husband, though, as I was writing, and I would read him a poem and have him guess the episode. Even if we had just watched it, he usually couldn't do it. So, so I think that they've moved far enough away from the plots, etc. A question that I have received quite a bit since I started talking about this project is why the X-Files? Why did I choose that? And if it's just because I'm a fan of that particular television show. I was really drawn to the tone of the first couple seasons. It's spooky, it's dark, it's raining. The characters are often walking around in these like impossibly foggy basements and abandoned buildings with these like huge flashlights. It frames all these long shots and shadows that look like they come straight from like German expressionism. So yeah, I guess you could say I'm a fan. But really for this project, it came down to the language for me that was being used. So for instance, someone recently asked me why not Star Trek? Well, Star Trek is a good show with good themes and highly enjoyable. Much of the language in that show and in other science fiction shows is made up in order to create this new reality that takes place in the future. So warp drives, positronic matrices, etc., don't exist. So if you were to understand a poem about them, you'd have to know what they are, i.e. be familiar with a television show and that's set in the future and the rules of that show and the language of that show. So in contrast, the X-Files is a show that's very much of our world and in our world, both containing hopes and fears and the mundane props and settings of America. So in this way, I think of it as a kind of pop poetry, one equally at home with pizza and motel rooms and the desire to glimpse the Loch Ness Monster. Pop poetry is something too that is kind of, when I think of pop poetry, I think of Joe Brainard's work. So for example, Joe Brainard wrote, one of his most famous books that you might remember is I Remember, where he builds a greater snapshot of culture and society in the world that he grew up in and the world that he's a part of, through a repetition of memories that, where he remembers everything from playing jacks to failing at essay contests, his mother crying, etc. To my knowledge, I don't think that there's like a specific genre of sci-fi poetry, except perhaps Vogon poetry. Although I think that a lot of non-scientists are drawn to the beauty of scientific concepts. So if you think about how we use like a word like magnetism colloquially, and I think that that's part of why people are drawn to sci-fi or to poetry that uses scientific metaphors. While some of these poems could be described as sci-fi poems, aliens and UFOs really do appear a lot. There are plenty that are about paradigm shifts or even just watching birds. Sorry. So one of the things that I noticed while I was writing these poems is that I was surprised by how easy it was to slip into dramatic monologues, to turn the speaker of the poem into a character who had a story to tell, a soapbox to stand on. Sometimes it's easy to mistake the speaker of the poem, the I character, with the author, but in these poems, I think characters really do come through on their own, so that, you know, if somebody's saying something, it's not like, oh, this is what Amaris Ketcham thinks, necessarily. So with that little introduction, I would like to go ahead and share a few of the poems with you. So let's see, I'm just going to start with the first poem that I wrote using this process. So this is from fall 2012. It kind of got me started on it because I surprised myself even while writing it and some of the things that came out. So it's called I Want to Believe. It's repurposed dialogue from season 1, episode 8. Loud and clear, solar winds blow across a trick of light and shadows, -3 seconds. So you think this X-ray is bogus? Lock your visors deep. How do you read a comeback like winged astronauts, knowing something might go wrong in a rusty old bucket? Can you trace T- an accident? I'm breaking up, I'm standing by, cutting off a dual thump, your boyhood hero. Houston, you take care. Beyond reentry, it's anybody's guess. Yeah, so that episode is just a classic astronaut going into space episode, gets haunted by like an otherworldly space ghost. You know, average sci-fi plot. But as I was watching it, I really was kind of drawn to this idea of what does it mean to have a hero from your childhood? And to have that hero fail you in some way. So they don't live up to the worship that you once bestowed upon them. Because all people are fallible, right? Even astronauts and basketball stars, etc. Okay, so this next poem is a little more playful. Yeah, I guess I'm really starting heavy on the aliens. We'll move out of aliens after a couple minutes though. So Ordinary Anti-Waltons, repurposed dialogue from season 1, episode 2. Do little green men ever wake from a deep sleep, read the newspaper and say, screw it, climb the ladder just to fall on their ass? Do they open their minds only to let someone mess with their heads? Do little green men ever get carried away, feel spooky or special, like they nailed it, or down and out and busted? I wonder what it means to be down to earth in another galaxy, leaving a bizarre fingerprint in another history, searching for a close encounter, any kind of message to make you feel like you've crawled out of a nest and you're still safe and awake for the first time. So little green men are mentioned quite often in the X-Files as a way to kind of poke fun at one of the main characters. So they come up quite a bit. So hard to read a room on Zoom, you know, I'm just gonna keep going though. All right, so let's see, when I was talking about the idea of writing a dramatic monologue, I've heard before that you can divide poetry up into 4 main modes. One of which is a dramatic monologue where a character is speaking and talking about their truth and how they see the world. And so this is one of those kinds of poems. It's called Schoolboy's New Age Ideas. It's repurposed dialogue from season 2, episode 10. Hey, little brother. Hey, buttcrumb. Don't get the creeps when I talk about soul transference in the age of Aquarius. It's just as pepperoni pizza is a blessing of the dawning of a new age, when we can all be holy, delivered from this monument to barbarism. Piss off all those keepers of scorecards. That dog-eat-dog spite will stick out like a sore thumb. What's this? You're just getting motion sickness from enlightenment. Like, don't have a dairy cow, mankind. I'm not ribbing you. I wouldn't Nixon you. Tainted pastures beget tainted pastures. Give it some earth years and this will make sense. Kind of like we're animal spirits kept as pets and bearing witness to a standstill between home and the magic of morning light. So I guess just for, if you all are curious, I don't know if you all are curious about like, what did that come from? That was an episode about like a rural town in Wisconsin where they bred cows and the children were all sort of getting sick and having these weird hallucinogenic adventures from the main doctor in town that was using like growth hormones on them. Yeah. All right. This next poem, it's kind of interesting. Sometimes when I was like working on these and culling my little words and putting my list together, I would start to kind of see in it like maybe a little reflection of myself. So in that way, maybe it's not entirely self-annihilation to write found poetry. So this one is a little bit more personal in that it kind of builds off of not just the words, the source material itself, but also some childhood memories that I have of living at my grandfather's, and there was a creek that we used to play in. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about that perhaps after the poem. But this is called Time for That Tetanus Booster. It's repurposed dialogue from season 2, episode 2. We used to test the water, dip our ankles in, gather eggs, grab at snakes, play in the field after, talking about monsters. Heavy rainfall made the sewers overflow into our waterway, raw, bizarre, discolored, not like real water, whatever the village flushed into the smelly underground catacombs. We called it Chernobyl and told lies about giant flukes who drew fools down there, made you eat bupkis, brush your teeth with sewage, scrub, 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 all with a smile. Think of the taste. This could be Jersey, the sea a radioactive soup, nature modeled by adults, the way the young warn one another, the shape of a life cycle. Yeah, so true story, this creek, we played in it all the time, catching crawdads. Not necessarily snakes and eggs, but, and every time it rained, the sewer manhole nearby, this like neon pink gunk would come out, and we would just be like, oh, weird, the neon pink gunk is here. And it was the, the 80s, so neon was cool. So we weren't like terrified of it as we should be, because yeah, don't play in neon pink stuff, right? All right. Let's see. The next poem that I've pulled out to read for you is called Folkstone. And I'm going to read that, and I'm also going to read the poem that follows it. Because, I mean, while I was writing these over the summer, there was a lot of stuff going on in our country and a lot of things to think about. And so some of these poems sort of, scratch at greater things that are happening in society, even just a little bit, although not directly, if that makes sense. So this one is Folkstone, repurposed dialogue from season 2, episode 15. Enough heavy dreaming and tales of impact. At a crossroads, saying uncool mercies and fighting back with nasty looks. Shame hangs from your shoulders like a broken peony. Enough grave processing of the true self. Loosen a little hell. Raise the dead, then snatch their stories. Graffiti freedom on every belief you see. Flip failure, its efficiency, even charming. A crack in the sidewalk, a mirror dug out of the sandbox. The easy magic of a pair of fuzzy dice. The Statue of Liberty, the light in her eyes. No voodoo can save you from the country's amnesia. Enough self-inflicted rituals. Freedom's a sacred trick, confined before known. Let's see. So I guess that one is originally about some Haitian refugees that are like trapped in a military internment camp. So there was a lot of potential to use French in that one. Although I guess I edited a lot of that French out. So anyway, okay. The next poem along those same veins is Foxfire Spirit, repurposed dialogue from season 2, episode 24. Leaving town was just a one second. Leaving town was just a formality. Good people chasing some sweet young superstition. Most legends don't leave behind hang-ups and turn-offs. Push comes to shove, the whole town welcomes a new story about hill people massacres, swamp gas in the field, scorched remains of spirits. Like some high-speed, repetitive activity, layabouts ward off determination. Man is a lion hypnosis. Troublemakers cling tight, witch pegs in their hands and folly stuffing their pillows at night. Some men build towns just to chop away at them, until the bonfires burn down and the faith once fed on ritual alone passes through the sponge-like holes in our stories. I guess another thing about the process of writing these is that, so some of the poems in here are haiku. Some are, do we have a comment in the chat? Oh, thanks, Megan. So some are haiku, some are sonnets, Petrarchan sonnets, not Shakespearean sonnets, for those of you all who care about the distinctions there. And then this one in particular, I wanted to try to see if I could rhyme one poem. And so I made it happen. So this poem is kind of just in sort of forcing yourself to further play with a different kind of constraint. Yeah, I'll just dive into it. It's Rush Hour on Tabloid TV. Repurposed dialogue from season 3, episode 22. Like our attention spans on the brink, our bitter fairy tales are going extinct, slewed by the wailing of another afternoon talk show. Straight from earthly confines, here be Loch Ness Monster and other monsters, National Geographic's pseudo-anomalies, prehistoric ramblings, collective crypto fears forgotten. Mysteries endangered, knows how to hide, perched in some mental cove, snapping once you're outside. Seek and ye shall find you are unknown. Track these happy obsessions, but don't turn your back when undoing neckties and opening the doors of perception. Out of the big blue comes another question about cosmology and cults, then folktales unzipping, speculation from warped significance, nipping at a discovery once drowned in TV currents before you heard the sound of your sea serpents. So that's also one of those poems that it really has a lot of like things, nouns, things that are important to people, particularly in the 1990s. The idea of rush hour, tabloid TV. Obviously, rush hour is not something we care about right now, right? Because nobody goes anywhere. So really tying it more firmly to the time and place that it was in. Let's see, I want to make sure to leave some time for questions, but I also want to give you like a really healthy sample of the book. I'll just read one more, I guess, and then we can open it up for questions. All right. So the one that I'll end it with here is one that really plays with a lot of the terms that are particular to the X-Files, that really kind of call forth maybe some of the dialogue and banter between the two FBI agents. It's called An Intergalactic Space Greeting, and it's repurposed dialogue from season 1, episode 16. Adu ne va so barragas. Your encounter, anecdotal data, trace evidence, self-delusion, swamp gas, lightning, downright spooky. Atmospheric conditions can play tricks on you. You're the only one I trust. A round-trip ticket taking an invasive route, a deep background heading west, risked exposure come full circle. A lie, so passionate, so blinding, the moon, half full, hidden between two truths. Means, hello, space brothers. Means, just a tourist on a dangerous path. All right. I'm going to quit sharing my screen with the hopes of seeing people as they ask questions.
I think Amaris would welcome any verbal questions you may have or questions that you want to place in the chat. I have a question to get us started while people are kind of formulating theirs. I was just wondering a little bit about your process. Like, how does the process of working in this kind of remix fashion differ from your normal poetic working process? Like, is this process more reductive or redactive than an additive process? Or can you tell us a little bit about just like how you write in this method that may differ from?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, that's a good question. So my last book of poems, The Poetic Inventory of the Sandia Mountains, was heavily researched. So in that book, I looked at different flora and fauna that are present in the Sandia Mountains, and I would research about them and then try to find like an interesting fact to build a poem around, or just something that kind of caught my attention about it. And because I also write a lot of essays, all my essays are really heavily researched, usually as well. There's also the kind of, this is probably a problem that's really particular to essayists, that it's almost more fun to research stuff than it is to write. and you sort of like, you're like, oh, I just want to keep reading because it's going to be hard to write. That becomes a way that you can procrastinate really well. So with the X-Files poems, like I couldn't do that. I didn't research anything. I just kind of dove right in. So the only research is watching the show, i.e. like laying around on the couch. Just a great way to research for something like this. So I think that process-wise, like that's probably the biggest difference between them. And then also that because I'm from more of an essay background, a lot of my poems, particularly in the last book, I think read more like essays than poems. And so with this work in particular, I tried to divorce myself from like worrying about how words mean all the time, and instead think about how they sound, and like how can you play with sound, and how can you play with like two unexpected words together to create new meaning or new sound.
Very cool. Thank you. That was so awesome. I see a few questions in the chat. Emily asked, how long usually does it take you to write your poems?
Yeah, so that's a hard question to answer. That's like, you know, each poem might take its own amount of time. So for this project, I only had a couple months to work on it. If I hadn't had a deadline, I'd probably still be like messing around with some of them to try to like nail the ending better or something like that. But I think in general, it would take probably a few hours to start working on a draft of the poems. The following question is kind of tied to that about looking at the entire script of an episode. And so I would read the whole script and from there kind of pick out words. I didn't mix episodes together. I thought about that because in some episodes I noticed that, like particularly the ones that are more crime focused, like there's a serial killer and they're going after him. There usually wasn't anything interesting in the dialogue. Like they didn't say anything interesting. It was more about the visuals of people getting brutally murdered or something. And so that was kind of another like, oh, that's interesting when the investigation becomes more about this one thing and less about these more spectacular things. The words that are used aren't very interesting, and they're often a lot fewer words in those episodes too.
There's another question in the chat from Haley.
Yeah, so playing with sound. So one of the ways that when you set up a project like this, you make a lot of rules for yourself, and then you start to, of course, break them. So one of the rules that I had made for myself was that I could take the original word, but then manipulate it. So you turn a word into past tense, make it into an adverb. There's one poem in particular where I looked at like how many words could I add the prefix un to in order to play with meaning and the idea of like constantly negating everything, and the negation that comes in through thinking about fantastical things. What is an honorary Kentucky colonel? Yeah, so it's an honorary title given out to people who are from Kentucky or who have spent, I think, a substantial amount of time in Kentucky. Kentucky's militia was abolished over 100 years ago. I think it was during the War of 1812. And so now to be a colonel, it's an honorary title that means you're a cultural ambassador, basically, of Kentucky. So other famous colonels include Muhammad Ali, Hunter S. Thompson, Johnny Depp, George Clooney. So other kind of famous people from Kentucky, basically.
And you're one too.
Yes, and I'm one too. I'm from Kentucky originally, although I've now lived in New Mexico longer than I've lived in Kentucky. Yes, and so I became, actually my journey to become a Kentucky colonel is kind of funny. I learned about it when I was in Juarez at the Kentucky bar. And the owner of the Kentucky bar, this guy Sergio, was an honorary Kentucky colonel and had his like certificate up. And so I asked about that. And he had spent a lot of time in Kentucky working on a horse farm. And then had gone down to Juarez and started this bar that was the original home of the margarita, which I doubt. And so from there, I petitioned the governor at the time to become a cultural ambassador as well. How many episodes did I write poems about? Well, in the book, there are 30 poems, but I wrote more, like a few more than that to kind of weed some out that I thought were less successful than others. So all in all, it's a little over 30 episodes and 30 poems. And most of them are within the first couple seasons of the show. So it's mostly seasons 1 through 3. So yeah, I don't know if I have a favorite episode. There are quite a few favorite episodes that I have. Most of them are written by the same person. And so many of those poems were in a way a little harder to write. The last one that I read to you that was about the sea monsters, that was one of those that it's Rush Hour on tabloid TV, where it's almost like there's too many specific things that are being mentioned in the transcripts in order to kind of tie them all together.
I have another question.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I'm not sure if I have an answer to a favorite poem. Yeah. What was your question, Megan?
Sorry to interrupt you. I'm just wondering, you touched upon this a little bit, but I'm just wondering, like, how did the pandemic itself sort of inform the creation of this body of work? Like my memory from, the late 90s of watching X-Files avidly is that, like, at its premise, it's sort of an investigation of truth and reality and fiction and what couldn't possibly be but actually is. And so there's all this discussion about reality that I think is explored. And I'm just wondering if that mapped on to any ideas that you were sort of exploring during the pandemic. I mean, I know you mentioned how you were drawn to the X-Files, but I'm just wondering if that had like sort of larger ripples on why you kind of went back to this work and thought about it specifically during this like very intense time. So I don't know if you have any musings on that, but I'm curious.
Yeah, I think in particular, I mean, so I sort of, I'm trying to think, I pitched the project in May and then I wrote it over the summer. So, so in the early time of the pandemic is when I had kind of started rewatching the television and just like, oh, it was sort of in the back of my mind. But then there was a lot of other stuff that was going on. For some reason I had to walk 20 miles a day or whatever to like ponder about whether or not we were all going to die of a virus. I think everyone was in that same boat, right? Yeah. Back in March, like, what's going on? What's going to happen? But I think that, particularly over the summer with a lot of the the protests about policing and thinking about paradigms and like what needs to topple, and what do we need to create afresh, that really started to kind of inform quite a few of the poems in its own way.
Very cool. Thank you.
Let's see. Leslie Donovan asks, will I continue writing this kind of found poetry, or am I ready to put it behind me? Well, that's a good question. I think I will probably still experiment with found poetry. It's a really good way to spark creativity and to to figure out like where do you want to investigate something further. One of the things I did for this poetic inventory of the Sandian Mountains, there's a poem in there about the black bear, where I was trying to figure out how to revise it to make it a better poem, and it occurred to me that I could redact part of it, and that would make it stronger. And so even like going into your own work and like cutting mercilessly is a good way to sort of maybe spark a new direction or really revise something drastically. Is New Mexico related to the content of the poems or the way that you approach them? Yeah, definitely. There are some poems about canyon nights and vastness. Also, obviously, Roswell. So now I don't think Roswell's mentioned at all. But I do think that that's sort of been kind of part of it. There's so much space tourism and space talk and space things here. I went to a creative placemaking summit last year, 2 years ago, sometime pre-pandemic time. And one of the things that they spoke about was creative placemaking in space. And these people that are trying to create communities in space before we even get there. And what does that look like? Yeah. So yeah, I also think that like where you are in your world always informs like what you're doing, and informs some aspect of what you're thinking about.
Are there any other questions that people want to ask verbally? I know there have been a bunch that have been addressed in the chat. Well, if not, thank you, Amaris, so much. This is really enlightening, and this is fabulous work. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your work.
Oh yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.
If you'd like to learn more about the book, you can check it out on the Caso Raca website. I'll just put a link in here. So thanks everyone for coming and asking questions, and you can always write me with more questions if you think of another one.